Previously on Ty's Hot Mess History. Well, Doris would have had a hard time finding a match who had as much money as she did. She was the richest girl who came out in her season. She came out the same year as Barbara Woolworth Hutton, who was also very rich, but not as rich as Doris. Doris was the richest. Barbara was the prettiest, according to all of the papers. The two young women had known each other for most of their lives and had been friends. But as they got older, things that gossip reporters wrote and romantic partners would come between the two ladies. Many of you have asked me to make a video about their feud after seeing my video about Barbara Hutton, and I will make that video. So here we are. We are talking about two women who have feuded over many things, including a man who was a husband to both of them. Barbara Woolworth Hutton and Doris Duke. Baby girls who were born with silver spoons in their mouths. Both born in New York, just days apart from each other in 1912. They started out as friends, and it only made sense. Not a lot of people would have had much in common with these two based on their wealth alone. When you have the kind of money that they had, your social circles stay relatively small. Barbara had about $60 million and Doris had about $100 million. And that sounds great. They could afford to buy anything that they could imagine. And they were just children. But their great fortunes came with sadness. They both inherited so much money at such a young age because each one had lost a parent. Doris lost her father when she was only 12. Barbara lost her mother to an apparent suicide when she was only 4 years old. Both girls lost the parent to whom they were the closest. So you can see that there's this amazing foundation for a friendship. Barbara and Doris had a very unique set of circumstances to which practically no one else in the world would have been able to relate. But because they both came into huge sums of money at the start of the Great Depression, the general public at the time wasn't really thinking about the emotional hardships that these two girls suffered in order to become millionaires. All that most people knew was that these two girls had a whole lot of money, and they, most Americans during the Great Depression, hardly had any. And this created another likeness that the girls shared, a common enemy, the poor Americans. And that gave the news media at the time just what they needed to capitalize off of this perfect storm that had been created. The poor people versus the rich girls. It was ugly, but newspaper writers knew that it would sell their papers. So gossip columnists would follow every move of Barbara and Doris and spin their stories in ways that pit the two girls against the American public, and later pit the two girls against each other. And that's when things really got juicy. This is the story of Barbara Woolworth Hutton, the Woolworth heiress, and Doris Duke, the American Tobacco Company heiress, and how their friendship turned into a decades-long catfight that was fueled by the press. This is the story of two rich friends turning into enemies and two hot messes in their own right. This is a story for us, so let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content. And please hit that thumbs up to support this video for free. Thank you. Now on to why you are here. The year is 1912, the same year that the Titanic sank. But it's exactly 7 months later, on November 14th, Edna Woolworth gave birth to the only child she and Franklin Hutton would ever have, a little girl named Barbara. Barbara was born an heiress to 1/3 of the estate of retail tycoon Frank Winfield Woolworth. He was the founder of the Woolworth brand of 5 and dime stores. They were called 5 and dimes because all of their merchandise was priced at 5 cents or 10 cents, at least for the first several years of the business. Then, only 8 days after Barbara was born, on November 22nd, came Doris Duke. Her mother was Nanaline Holt, and her father was tobacco tycoon James Buchanan Duke. Doris was their only child, and she was an heiress also. destined to inherit a huge portion of her father's wealth upon his passing. So already we see that we have the two girls born into a very unusual set of circumstances, and they practically mirror each other. Both born in the same month, in the same city, and both the only child and the only daughter at that, born into a lot of money. It only made sense that they would cross paths at some point and possibly become friends. But here's the tragic element that Barbara and Doris shared. Each girl, in order to gain her inheritance, would have to lose the parent who loved them the most. For Barbara, it was her mother who died of an apparent suicide when Barbara was only 4 years old. Barbara is the one who discovered her mother's lifeless body in the family's hotel suite. Barbara's father was known to constantly cheat on his wife, and after she died, he didn't concern himself much with Barbara. He pawned her off on other relatives and went off to live his own life, remarrying rather quickly. It was her mother's death that made her a multimillionaire, but Barbara never recovered from losing her mom at such a young age. For Doris, it was losing her father that turned her into a millionaire and broke her heart at the same time. Doris's father doted on her, while her mother was rather distant and disconnected from Doris. It seems like no one in the world would have been more equipped to understand Barbara than Doris, and no one would have been more equipped to understand Doris than Barbara. There was a 1917 film called Poor Little Rich Girl, and by the time that Barbara and then Doris inherited the first installments of their inheritances, they were both referred to as Poor Little Rich Girls, a not-so-nice and sarcastic way to say to each of them, yeah, she has problems, but don't we all? At least she gets to cry inside of the confines of her mansion. After Barbara's mother passed away in 1917, she had to wait another 7 years to start receiving her third of her grandfather's estate, roughly $60 million. And that's because she couldn't get the money until her grandmother passed away. That happened in 1924. Then in 1925, Doris's father died, leaving her $100 million. Now, at this time, both of the girls were still minors, so their money was held in trust and managed by guardians. But until they could receive the lion's share of their fortunes, extremely generous living allowances were handed out to each of them. People on the outside looking in would not have realized that any funds had been held back from them. Doris and Barbara had their own private railroad cars with their names gilded onto the sides, more expensive clothing than anyone could imagine, and servants to attend to their every need. And of course, they both attended finishing school, so that they could learn everything that an affluent girl needs to know about social graces and etiquette. You name it, if it existed in the 1920s, they had it. But did all of the material things make them happy? Something else that they both had in common was multiple mansions. And that probably also sounds like something that a lot of people would want. But for Barbara and Doris, these residences seemed more like long-stay hotels than homes, and they never stayed in any place for more than a few months at a time. And moving around so often makes it hard for a young person to make close friends. They barely had family that they enjoyed being around. But that was the life of a poor little rich girl, so sad in her gilded cage, using $100 bills as tissues to wipe away her tears. Barbara and Doris were called something else too, not just the poor little rich girls. They were also called the Gold Dust Twins. Twins in Doris's dreams. She always envied Barbara's beauty. But where Barbara and Doris were concerned, that name, Gold Dust Twins, had certainly evolved and was changed to tailor-fit them because gold was a representation of wealth. But the original Gold Dust Twins were a trademark for Fairbanks Gold Dust washing powder, a brand that started in the 1890s and featured a cartoonish caricature of two black bald children on top of gold coins with their logo on the front. That's just a side note. 30 years later, the terminology of Gold Dust Twins meant something totally different in reference to Barbara and Doris. But I must say that I find it odd that they were ever called twins of any sort, when I take into account how the press played up their obvious differences in appearance and attractiveness. The news writers made it clear that they thought that Barbara was the pretty one and Doris was not. And they really emphasized the point when it came time for their debutante balls in 1930. In my opinion, this is the first major wedge that came between their friendship, and it only went downhill from here. These two young ladies came of age, hosting their debutante balls in 1930. In their high society world, the debutante ball was their way of coming out as an adult woman who was on the marriage market. Now, other wealthy young men would be able to court Barbara and Doris. These galas were a big deal, and they were meant to be fun. Unfortunately for the Gold Dust twins, the backdrop for their debutante season was the beginning of the Great Depression, the biggest economic downturn in modern history. So that made their parties a little less fun. Both Barbara and Doris received a lot of backlash from the media for spending tens of thousands of dollars for one single party, while at the same time, a lot of citizens couldn't even afford to eat one meal a day. Doris and Barbara's families were spending $60,000 to $80,000 for one night of partying, while most Americans were figuring out how to survive on less than $500 a year, which is roughly the same as $10,000 today in 2024. Both Barbara and Doris each had tens of millions of dollars at their disposal, which is roughly a whole lot more today. While these two dames were swimming in dough, the other Americans who weren't lucky enough to have low-paying jobs found themselves on the streets, sleeping under Hoover blankets. What were Hoover blankets? A direct jab at President Hoover, who was lucky enough to be the man at the helm of the country, the president, at the onset of the Great Depression. So as a joke, all things that were associated with abject poverty were attached to his name. A Hoover flag was an empty pocket turned inside out, showing that the pocket contains no money, nothing but lint. There was also Hoover leather. That was the cardboard that poor people would use to line their shoes when the soles wore out. And there was the Hoover wagon. That was a car with horses hitched to the front of it to move it from point A to point B. The horses were there because the engine wasn't. And then, of course, there were Hoover blankets. Those were the newspapers that homeless people would use to cover themselves up at night when they slept on the streets. And it's not at all far-fetched to think that a story or two about Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton would have graced the surface of a Hoover blanket. Barbara Woolworth Hutton and Doris Duke had all of the material possessions that you and I could ever dream of, and they also had emotional baggage that you would never wish on your worst enemy. And because they came up in a time when simply being wealthy made one famous, they were also constantly under attack by the press. When they were younger, their millions insulated them from some of the cruelty that they would face later in life. Their gilded cages offered them some protection. But now, in 1930, they were adults, and the press decided that they weren't going to pull any punches with these young women. They were rather brutal when it came to reporting about them. And while Doris and Barbara were both demonized for being rich and throwing their soirees, it is my opinion that the press started pitting the young ladies against each other just before their debutante balls, and they decided that they would favor Barbara, at least at first. Take a look at this article about their upcoming debutante balls. It's about how the richest debutantes will soon make their bow to New York society. It labels Doris as the richest and Barbara as the prettiest. Now, in a story about the richest debutantes, it seems like Doris would have the biggest photo, doesn't it? I mean, she was the richest. But no, Barbara gets the biggest photo, and Doris gets a much smaller insert. And to top it off, it's a photo taken from her profile angle, which shows her least flattering feature, her big, protruding chin, something that it was widely known that she did not like about her appearance. No one in his or her right mind would have thought that this would have gone unnoticed between Doris and Barbara. Imagine how Doris felt. The girl you've been compared to your whole life is basically being called objectively prettier than you in front of the world, right before one of the most important days of your life. But at the time, Doris handled it with grace, later admitting that she thought Barbara was pretty and that she envied her good looks. But that was the press against Doris and Barbara. The first strike that the women took against each other was centered around the husband that they shared in common, but we'll get there. As far as 1930 was concerned, they still appeared to be friends as far as anyone knew. Barbara attended Doris's ball at her Rough Point mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, and Doris attended Barbara's ball at the Ritz-Carlton in New York. In case you want to keep score, Doris had the bigger party with 600 guests compared to Barbara's 100. Then, 3 years after their big society debuts, Barbara and Doris both turned 21. That meant that they were full-fledged adults and now able to start receiving the principal of their inherited fortunes. Now the young ladies could spend their money on whatever they wanted, and their two biggest spending categories were homes and husbands. From this point in their relationship, I think that it's fair to call Barbara and Doris frenemies. In case you're not familiar with that term, it's a fairly new one. Here's how Oxford Languages defines it. Frenemy, a person with whom one is friendly despite a fundamental dislike or rivalry. It's all in the name, a mix of friend and enemy. Often, frenemies are people who have a lot in common, like their profession or station in life, and these commonalities form the basis for their friendship. But they also have some differences that may become the source of friction. Doris and Barbara were no different. So I'm going to tell you about their similarities, their differences, and the anecdotes that made their rivalry insane. One of the biggest things that Doris and Barbara had in common was that they shared a belief in psychics and faith healers. This was a particularly odd thing to learn about Doris, knowing that her father, with whom she was so close, firmly believed in Christianity and held fast to his Methodist values all of his life. And they say that money can't buy style, and that's true, but it seems that both Doris and Barbara spent their money well when it came to fashions because they were both on the best dressed list. The year was 1940. Barbara had made the list before, but this was Doris's first time making the list, the top 10 best-dressed women in the world. They were joined by duchesses, other heiresses, and the Queen of England, who had just made it on the list at number 10. Barbara made it into the slot above the Queen at number 9. The first-timer, Doris, was number 4. So I guess that we can give that point to Doris. It was noted that all of the women in the top 10 had paid more than $1 million for her clothing. This was during the time that Doris's first husband, James Cromwell, had been appointed United States Minister to Canada. Doris bought a wardrobe that suited her new role as minister's wife. This was also during the early days of World War II, and I'm sure it didn't do anything to help Doris or Barbara win any extra brownie points with the American public, who would have seen these two as pompous princesses frolicking in their expensive gowns, while other women's husbands and sons were being drafted to fight. In addition to making the best-dressed list, both Barbara and Doris got dropped from the New York Social Register. The New York Social Register is a directory of wealthy socialites in New York City that started back in the 1880s. But having a lot of money isn't enough to keep someone on the list of well-connected people. When the new list for 1936 was made at the end of 1935, Barbara, who was then Countess von Haugwitz-Reventlow, would have found out right after her birthday that her name was no longer in that elite space. But at the time, she was living in her husband's castle in Denmark, and that's most likely why she was dropped, simply because she wasn't living in New York. But having a change of address wasn't the only thing that could get one kicked off of the register. Often, going through a divorce was a reason too. It was seen as a scandal. That was the case for Doris when she found out after her birthday in 1944 that neither her name nor her husband's, James Cromwell, would appear in the 1945 New York Social Register. At the time, they were in the middle of a nasty divorce. Two, if you consider that he filed for one in New Jersey and she filed for one in Reno. I guess the point goes to Barbara for not getting kicked off of the list due to a divorce scandal. As Barbara got kicked off in 1935, the Roosevelt name was brought back to the register. And in 1944, when Doris was getting kicked off, 3 members of the Vanderbilt family were not restored, but an Astor was added. The Poughkeepsie Journal said that it was Mrs. John Jacob Astor III, but she died in 1887, so I doubt that the registry committee would have been clamoring to get her name on there. My guess is that they were referring to the wife of John Jacob Astor VI, the Titanic baby who was born the same year as Doris and Barbara. There was a lot of confusion about which John Jacob Astor he was, as he was often called the third, the fourth, and the fifth. That confusion is cleared up in a video that I published about him. I'll tell you about it later. Back to Barbara and Doris. Doris had a Moroccan-style home in Hawaii that she named Shangri. It featured elements from Middle Eastern palaces and a priceless collection of Islamic art, as well as a pair of camels that she imported to wander about the lawn, to make her guests really feel like they were in the Middle East. Well, only a few years after Doris built Shangri-La, guess who went and bought a home that looked very similar in Tangier of all of the places in the world? You guessed it, Barbara. She bought a 16th century palace named Sidi Hosni. Did Barbara really want everything that Dora had? This kind of made it seem that way. Not to mention that when Doris's camels became a topic of discussion, Barbara didn't get her own, but she made sure to invite over rich friends who had their own camels. And Barbara, who was known to have a taste for more modern decor, even decorated her palace in a style very similar to Doris's, filling it with Middle Eastern antiques that didn't mean a thing to her. Surely the only joy that she got from her furnishings was knowing that they irritated Doris. There was also a really tragic experience that they both shared, and that was losing a child. Each lady gave birth to one child and lost that child. For Doris, it was her baby Arden, who lived only 25 hours after she was born. In Barbara's case, it was her son Lance, who had grown to be a really decent young man. He died in an aircraft crash as Barbara was getting up in age. So you can see that from the very beginning of their lives, Barbara and Doris shared a truly unique set of circumstances that bonded them in this really exclusive sisterhood. Whether or not they liked each other, they understood each other's predicaments. The final likeness that these debutantes shared was their craziness when it came to men. And of course, their biggest clashes had to do with the men they shared, or tried to share. We're getting there. It's how these two dealt with men that brings us into their differences. The main difference is that Barbara was the marrying type, where Doris wasn't. Barbara married and divorced a total of 7 times. Doris got married and divorced only twice. But she had a few lovers as well, even one who claimed to be her husband, but he wasn't. We'll talk about him. Another massive difference between Barbara and Doris was their spending habits. Coming into so many millions at the time that they did, it probably seemed like it would be impossible to ever run out of money. And that's how Barbara spent her money, in a very careless manner, like it would never end. And by the time she died, she had practically none of it left. To be frank, Barbara was nowhere near as smart as Doris with her money. Yet, she often felt inclined to take digs at Doris, calling her cheap. Meanwhile, Doris was unlike a lot of her peers who inherited extreme wealth. Most of them only knew how to spend it. Over Doris's lifetime, she grew her $100 million fortune into over $1 billion. During a gathering at Doris's home, Hollywood Golden Age actor Errol Flynn made a joke about Barbara's extravagance when he pointed at one of Doris's chandeliers and asked, "Doris, What are you doing with one of Barbara's earrings? I gotta admit, that's a good one, because Barbara was known for wearing really big jewelry. Everyone knew that she was rich, but she really felt the need to show everyone that she was. There's no doubt that Errol's joke got back to Barbara. Their close circle of friends did as much as the press to instigate spats between Doris and Barbara. Nevertheless, the point goes to Doris for handling her money so wisely. And the last important difference between these two that we've already touched on is their appearance, or at least the public's perception of how they looked, because that is something that helped to fuel the feud. From the start, Barbara was always seen as the beauty. Her photos were put right in the mix with the biggest movie stars of her day, and people said that she fit right in with them. Barbara, they said, was glamorous. Doris, on the other hand, was a 6-foot-tall, awkward, lanky girl with the big chin. She just wasn't in vogue in her day, and she suffered some harsh comments in the media because of it. Now, a lot of you have already watched the video that I published about Doris, and many of you have said that she was prettier than Barbara, and that by today's standards, she could be a fashion model. I'm just going to say that how a thing starts isn't always how it finishes. Perhaps before today's story is over, public perception about Barbara's and Doris's attractiveness might have switched. Yeah, with a little help from plastic surgery, but still, the tables turned. Now, in case you don't know, I have already published 2 videos about these ladies, one profiling Barbara and another profiling Doris. You might want to check them out before finishing this one, or after you finish watching this one if you want to learn more about their lives. I'll leave links to them in the description box and in the pinned comment. But now, we've got to get to the nitty-gritty of this back and forth. And it all starts with the man who both Doris and Barbara married. The man with the big private part, Porfirio Rubirosa. And let's be clear, there wasn't really anything private about his part. He was known to share it with a lot of women. I'm going to take you back in time on my channel to refresh your memory about him. Doris married him first. Let me remind you of how that wedding went and give you a little more information on Doris and Porfirio. In May of 1947, just a couple of months into her new job, Harper's Bazaar sent Doris out on assignment to Rome. Her task was to interview the French actress Danielle Darieux. The interview took place in Danielle's hotel room. Danielle's husband joined the ladies. Danielle's husband was Porfirio Rubirosa. Maybe no one in the room knew it during the magazine interview, but Rubirosa would become Doris's second husband not long after the ink was dry on her interview notes. Here's how Rubirosa described what happened after that interview in his own words. Quote, "The 3 of us had breakfast. She, meaning Doris, seemed lively, jovial, with that je ne sais quoi that American women can have. Little did I know that a few months later, I would be completely controlled by her. Until then, I had been happy with Danielle, but at this moment, things started to change." End quote. And things started to change immediately, because right after this meeting, Doris took it upon herself to send this married man a telegram that read, quote, "When you are finished with Danielle, call me and I will come." End quote. Porfirio Rubirosa took one look at what the paper said was in her bank account and said, "Baby, you don't have to tell me twice. Just give me the address for the wedding altar and tell me what color tuxedo you'd like me to wear, and I'll be there, because this is about to be the easiest money I've ever made in my life." You see, everybody knew about Doris's money, and there was something else that everyone knew, but fewer people said, and that was that Doris was unattractive. At least that's how a lot of men saw her. Remember that her fellow 1930 debutante Barbara Hutton was called the pretty one, and Doris was called the rich one. And it really seems that Doris's vast fortune, plus her sheltered life, insecurity, and deficiency in the looks department made her an easy target for men who wanted to use her. That certainly seemed to be the case with Rubirosa. Looks aren't everything, but to a lot of people, they matter. Even Doris's mother had warned her that he was not attracted to her and only interested in her money. But in his memoir, one of Rubirosa's friends made it clear that he thought Doris was pretty ugly. He explained his surprise at Rubirosa being with Doris in these words, quote, "She was ugly, very rich, but ugly. He was a gentleman. He would never say that," end quote. Doris married him on September 1st, 1947. If you're paying attention, you see that is the year before James Cromwell's divorce was settled. Her new husband was Porfirio Rubirosa, the man with the big penis. If you've already seen my video about the Woolworth heiress, Barbara Woolworth Hutton, then you might remember a little bit about him. He cheated on Barbara with Gabor and had a long string of Hollywood bed partners that included, but was by no means limited to, Marilyn Monroe, Eartha Kitt, Ava Gardner, and Dorothy Dandridge. He's our favorite Hollywood husband because of his long name. What did you think that I was going to say? Get your mind out of the gutter. Porfirio Rubirosa Ariza was a diplomat from the Dominican Republic and an international playboy. He was 39 at the time, and Doris was 34. He started dating Doris publicly right after he divorced his second wife. She was Danielle Deriot, the most famous actress in France at the time. He divorced her in May of 1947. Then literally in June of 1947, he started showing up everywhere with Doris on his arm. This man didn't waste any time. He spread his love around, and according to the ladies of his time, he had plenty to share. This is the same guy whose male member became the inspiration for large pepper grinders in fine dining establishments all over the world. They called the big ones Rubirosas. After dating for only 3 months, he and Doris got married in a small, private ceremony in Paris. The ceremony was different. Rubirosa was often described in papers as tall, dark, and handsome. But Doris was taller. And let's face it, people still think that it's a little odd to see a couple in which the woman is taller than the man. Doris, at 6 feet, stood 3 inches taller than her new husband, and as we know, he made up for those 3 inches in another area. But their height difference wasn't the only thing that people might have found to be strange about this wedding. It was performed by a consul general who admitted that he had never performed a wedding, and his nervousness made that quite obvious. Only 10 of the people in attendance were actual guests of the bride and groom. Their guests were far outnumbered by reporters and photographers. The whole thing lasted 10 minutes, during which Rubirosa casually puffed on a cigarette, putting it out just in time to slip the ring on Doris's finger. It was a circlet of rubies, by the way. Another detail that was a little unusual, they had what I think could be considered as a reception before the wedding. Their guests had champagne and cake, and the new groom had 2 whiskey highballs. I don't know exactly what a highball is, feel free to tell me, but they did all of this before the exchange of vows. All of the alcohol seemed to put Rubirosa in high spirits. He was all smiles and laughs, until 2 of Doris's attorneys walked in with papers for him to sign. A prenuptial agreement. Maybe this payday wouldn't be quite as easy as he thought. But after having a few more drinks, enough to get drunk enough to be okay with signing the agreement, he did. Then they had their ceremony, and he passed out shortly after saying his vows. Doris thought that it was all wonderful, bragging to her friends that, quote, "Big boy passed out in my arms," end quote. If she'd had a little more self-esteem, she might have had a problem with a man needing to get drunk to say wedding vows to her. And speaking of the vows, they were another aspect of this wedding that was different. Very different from her first wedding in the regard that she promised to obey Rubirosa. You'll recall that to obey was not a part of the vows in the Cromwell-Duke union, and the fact that Doris promised to obey Rubirosa was such a shock that it made headlines. Well, the marriage didn't last much longer than that 10-minute wedding. And if Doris didn't want to feel like she was being used for her money in her second marriage the way that she had been used in her first marriage, she started off on the wrong foot. Remember that as soon as Rubirosa left Danielle, he and Doris were an item. Divorces usually take a while, as Doris knew from first-hand experience. Well, Doris didn't want to wait out a long divorce before she could have Rubirosa all to herself, so she paid Danielle $1 million in exchange for a quick, uncontested divorce. And with that small payout, Doris got her Latin lover all to herself. Or so she thought. We'll get there. But a quick side note about Danielle first. We all know that she selflessly gave up Rubirosa for $1 million so that Doris could have her happily ever after. But when Danielle tried to move on and marry the man she was interested in, a French actor named Pierre with a last name that I won't even attempt, it didn't matter for them. Why? Because his mother put the kibosh on their plans. According to Danielle, quote, his mother said, I am a woman with a past, and Pierre obeyed her orders forbidding the marriage, end quote. Pierre's mother thought that any woman who had ever been with Rubirosa was damaged goods. But I love the way that Danielle summed up the reason that she couldn't marry Pierre. She said that the problem was simply too much mother-in-law before the wedding. Well, we know how that can be, right, ladies? Ha ha. Anyway, by the time that Rubirosa was through with Doris probably wished that someone would have intervened and stopped her plans before they started, because he was not a good and faithful husband to her. But women aren't victims on this channel, so considering how she started her romance with him, I can't feel sorry for her knowing that he was not good to her. And I just know that somewhere in the world, Doris's first husband, James Cromwell, was somewhere wondering why Doris didn't turn on her money faucets for him the way that she did for Rubirosa. So remember, Jimmy Cromwell walked away with a measly $350,000 after having been married to Doris for years. Well, here is just a little bit of what Doris willingly gave to Rubirosa without his even having to ask her. She gave him a check for $500,000. With that, he was already ahead of Jimmy, but she had a lot more to give her new husband. A stable of polo ponies, over a dozen sports cars, a B-25 bomber, a French chateau that was converted from a hotel to a dwelling unit for him, and she filled that chateau with priceless art pieces from Kings Louis XV and Louis XVI. Rubirosa loved his chateau. It was 3 stories high, and he used the 3rd floor as his personal luxury man cave. He decked it out with a regulation-sized boxing ring and a full bar. After his late nights at the Calvados nightclub, which were practically every night, the club's guitarists would bring their instruments to the 3rd floor of his chateau, and they would party some more. His 3rd floor became an unofficial after-hours spot. Rubirosa's butler, Victor, would serve his guests whatever they wanted to drink and breakfast tacos. It must be nice to be married to an heiress who loves you so much that she won't say no to you. I think that author Stephanie Mansfield perfectly and succinctly described the tone of the Rubirosa-Duke union in her book called The Richest Girl in the World, The Extravagant Life and Fast Times of Doris Duke, when she wrote this, quote, while Doris fell in love with Ruby, he didn't want to be the man of just one woman, and she was not easy. She wanted Ruby to be there always, like a slave, but he wanted to do as he pleased. and she knew this before she married him." End quote. Bottom line, Doris got what she paid for, and what she paid for was a gigolo. And a gigolo can give you one thing: sex. The problem for Doris was that that's what a gigolo gives to other women as well. She found this out for herself when she and her husband were enjoying some time on the beautiful island of Capri in Italy. Earlier in the day, she was out doing her own thing. When she returned to their hotel, she found her husband doing his own thing. She caught Ruby in flagrante delicto. You know, getting it on with his ex-wife, not the one that Doris had paid $1 million to take off of her hands, his first wife, Flor de Oro Trujillo, the daughter of the Dominican dictator Rafael Trujillo, Rubirosa's boss. Well, Doris was a fool for Rubirosa, but there's only so much humiliation that even she could take. Immediately after this incident, he recalled seeing a new guest for lunch. It was an attorney, and he brought with him some papers for Rubirosa to sign, an agreement to terminate the marriage at once. The divorce was finalized on October 27, 1948. They were married only for 1 year and almost 2 months. Ruby walked away with the chateau, by this point 15 luxury sports cars, the bomber jet, a Manhattan apartment, the stable of ponies, a fishing fleet off of an African coast, and $25,000 per year until he remarried. Doris walked away with her name and memories of some really good sex. Even though Rubirosa was literally caught with his pants down, he didn't understand why their marriage needed to end. Because according to him, he and Doris were still seeing each other and being intimate for a whole year after they got divorced. In his words, quote, "This was so stupid because we did not want to be separated. For the next year, all we did was reunite, break, reunite in the back of airplanes in between the United States and Europe." End quote. It seems like Ruby didn't understand that Doris wanted to have him all to herself. She couldn't have that while she was married to him, and you and I know that she was sharing his baloney pony after they got divorced. But in Rubirosa's mind, he was just a good guy who was performing a public service for this lonely, homely heiress. Really, when you hear his own words, he comes across as though he thought he was doing the Lord's work when he married Doris. Here's what he had to say, quote, "What I did is better than most people do. They go out with a girl from a good family, they take all her money, and then they leave her. The difference with me is that I marry her, give her the best time in all the world, and when I leave her, she is richer than ever before." End quote. What a great guy. You're still with me, so I may as well give you one more quick side note about Ruby. It's about him, but it relates to Doris too. Zsa Zsa Gabor couldn't wait for her chance to get in bed with Rubirosa, but the reason that she wanted to have sex with him had everything to do with Doris Duke. Here's the thing. Zsa Zsa had commented publicly in Los Angeles that she would like to have an affair with Rubirosa to get revenge for the relationship that her husband, George Sanders, allegedly had with Rubirosa's ex-wife, Doris Duke, in 1952. The thought of someone cheating on the very glamorous Zsa Zsa Gabor with Doris Duke seemed a little off to me, so I went to see if I could find anything that might suggest that this was actually true, and I found it. On August 22nd, 1952, the Evening Sun printed a story about a new Charlie Chaplin film that had opened, and there were a few strange couples there. Among them were Doris Duke and George Sanders, and this was very strange, seeing that he was out in public on a date with Doris Duke, considering that at this point, he was Zsa Zsa Gabor's husband and had been for the past 3 years. So in Zsa Zsa's mind, a little fun in the bed with Rubirosa was for payback, even though Doris had been divorced from him for a few years by the time Zsa Zsa got to him. And I have to say that I think that it's odd that she was only interested in getting revenge on Doris and not her husband, the one who had cheated on her. Well, Zsa went on to have her affair with Rubirosa, but that hot sex came with a side of physical abuse, as was evidenced when she came out in public with an ice pack, covering a black eye that Rubirosa gave her when he punched her in the face during an argument about the next woman he planned on marrying, Barbara Hutton, the Woolworth heiress. But Zsa found no fault in Ruby for her black eye. As a matter of fact, she was quoted as saying, "Ruby loves me. Rubirosa in Spanish means red rose. For me, it means black eye. A man only hits a woman if he loves her deeply." End quote. How sickening. And I'm pretty sure that red rose in Spanish is rosa roja. But there are so many other things wrong with that statement that part doesn't even matter. I digress. Zsa wasn't the only woman who found no fault in Rubirosa. I'm skipping ahead of myself a little bit, but I should mention here that Doris Duke also never had a bad thing to say about her cheating Latin lover husband. And that's according to Doris's longtime friend and fellow socialite, Lucy Douglas CZ Guest, who shared that when Doris died, there were only 2 photographs next to her bed on her nightstand. One was of Louis Bromfield, the other was of her precious Porfirio Rubirosa. Now that we know that Rubirosa was the love of Doris's life, you can imagine why it would have been particularly painful for her when Barbara started dating him and then married him. But for some reason, it also hurt Zsa Gabor, who was still married to George Sanders at the time. As a matter of fact, Zsa Gabor seemed more emotionally invested than Doris or Barbara, but we'll get into her antics in a moment. For now, let's get into Barbara's union with Rubirosa. Imagine that you're Doris, and it's New Year's Day 1954. You're in Geneva with your friends, celebrating the new year. You start your morning with orange juice, and maybe you take your orange juice with a little bit of champagne. Maybe you call it a mimosa. And you've got your breakfast and your newspaper. Then you sit down and you read this international newspaper headline: Ruby and Babs wed, her first in Spanish. Doris was floored, pissed off, and drunk. She started calling Barbara every name in the book. Doris told her friends that Barbara had always been jealous of her. And, quote, "She always wants what I have." Now, somebody else was upset. Mrs. Marion O'Brien Reynolds was kind of surprised about this wedding announcement, too. Who was she? Oh, just a woman who was in the process of getting a divorce from her husband, who had filed against her for sleeping with Rubirosa. I think that she thought that she would have been his next wife instead of Barbara. But it has to be said that while Doris was extremely angry, she wasn't completely blindsided by the news of this marriage between her Ruby and her gal pal Babs. You see, Rubirosa came crawling around Barbara at a really vulnerable time in her life. She had just divorced her 4th husband, and it was clear to anyone with 2 brain cells that she was starved for male attention, and what she hoped for was love. But while Barbara was falling in love with Ruby, her family members were keeping a close eye on him. Barbara's aunt Jessie Donahue told her to call Doris to get her assessment of him, and I can understand her Aunt Jessie making this request. Clearly, she was looking for a bad opinion of Ruby because she didn't want Barbara to go through with marrying him. And who better to give a bad evaluation of a man than his ex-wife? It was a foolproof plan. The problem was that both Doris and Barbara were fools when it came to the man with the big penis. Doris told Barbara that Rubirosa was a great guy, a perfect gentleman, the most pleasant man a girl could ask for. And because Barbara was a fool, she didn't think to ask, well, if he was so great, why in the hell did you divorce him? Instead, Barbara took Doris's A+ assessment of Ruby and went straight to the chapel to get married, basically telling her family, "My friend who hates me said that he's a great guy, so don't worry, everything will be fine." All right, so Here are the details that I shared with you about the Barbara and Rubirosa marriage in a previous video. Her next husband was Porfirio Rubirosa. He didn't have an official title like prince or baron or count, but he had an unofficial title, and it was Latin lover. He was an international playboy. This man had sexual affairs with Marilyn Monroe, Eartha Kitt, Ava Gardner, Dorothy Dandridge, Judy Garland, and that doesn't even cover half of his long list of lovers. They might have also called him the Meat Man, because the word around town was that he was packing, and I don't mean suitcases. I mean he had a large penis, so worthy of discussion that, you know, the big pepper mills that they use at restaurants? Well, in fine dining establishments, they started calling them Rubirosas. Now, that was them being disgusting, not me. I'm just reporting to you. But the scandal where our Barbara is concerned has everything to do with who he was married to before her and who else he was having sex with while he was married to her. Porfirio was a Dominican diplomat and a race car driver who got married a total of 5 times in his life. His third wife was Doris Duke. She was an American heiress who came out had her debutante ball the same year as Barbara. They had actually been friends. They were always mentioned in the news together. The year of their society debuts, Barbara was the second richest debutante. The richest girl of the season was Doris. But all of the papers said that Barbara was the prettiest girl of the season. So you can see how early in their lives the press started brewing a scenario that would have made competition for these two ladies almost inevitable. But it was up to them, Barbara and Doris, to play into it or not. And I have to say that it looks like Barbara decided to play their dirty game. This is where I think she went wrong. Now, I believe in girl code, and when we are friends with someone, we don't get involved with their exes. Do you play by this code? Let me know in the comments section, because Barbara did not play by this code. Doris was married to Porfirio for a little over a year, from 1947 till 1948. That would have been while Barbara was married to Prince Igor. But as soon as she was single at the same time as Porfirio, she made a move on him, and he went for it. And at this time in Barbara's life, I feel like her heart just went dark, and she wasn't really thinking about anyone except for herself. And maybe a string of horrible marriages will do that to someone, but I really don't like how she handled Doris. On their wedding day, after Barbara said I do to Porfirio, she broke her ankle, leaving her confined to their honeymoon suite. And Porfirio, so excited about his new marriage, went out on the town to celebrate by himself. Well, what Barbara didn't see coming, but frankly she should have seen it coming, was that Porfirio was going to cheat on her, and he did it very publicly with a very public figure. Have you ever heard of Zsa Zsa Gabor? She was a very famous actress who was Porfirio's girlfriend while Barbara was his wife. Which wasn't a long time, by the way. Their marriage only lasted for 53 days. Barbara did have to pay him alimony, and I can't feel sorry for her on this one. Because when he divorced her friend, Doris, she saw what Doris had to give him in their divorce settlement. And it was a lot. A fishing fleet, a B-25 bomber, which is strange to me, a chateau in Paris, a whole bunch of sports cars, and $25,000 per year until he remarried, which ended up being a total of $125,000 because Doris got to stop making those payments in 1953. That's when backstabbing Barbara made him her problem. So I'm sure that Doris thanked her for being a gal pal and putting an end to those payments for her. Barbara and Doris went on to feud publicly for years. That entire situation is a hot mess scandal for another day. Let me know if you want to hear that story. But where Porfirio was concerned, Barbara should have felt like a fool. After being cheated on in such a public manner, she would lose her man and some more of her fortune. Porfirio would receive from Barbara another B-25 bomber. Why anyone would need one of those, let alone two, I don't know. He also got some expensive jewelry, some polo ponies, a coffee plantation in the Dominican Republic, and $2.5 million. Barbara had the use of this man's phallus for less than 2 months, and she had to share it. Doris had it for a year, and paid a lot less to get rid of him. She definitely got more bang for her buck, pun intended. Now, I've learned a little bit more about Barbara and Rubirosa since I made that first video for you. I learned that Ruby seriously pursued Barbara, and his main reason for hunting her down was that he needed money. He was already having an affair with Jaja before he met Barbara, but Jaja wasn't the type to give or loan out money to men, and he needed money so that he could wine and dine Jaja the way that she expected to be wined and dined. So Ruby thought to himself, who's another dame with a lot of dough? And Barbara was the perfect fit. She had a lot of money and a history of being publicly humiliated by men. Now, as we know, just because Barbara didn't see the red flags with Rubirosa didn't mean that her family couldn't. For Barbara, those red flags were looking like Six Flags, and she was just ready to have some fun. But it's so clear in the photos that Life magazine published from their wedding that Barbara was the only one there who didn't see that disaster was in her very near future. Her son, Lance, was 17 at the time, and he looked like he'd rather have been taking a trigonometry exam than sitting at that stupid wedding. And Rubirosa literally looked like he was trying to hold in his laughter. And when you consider that he left Barbara just hours after this photo was taken, so that he could go and have sex with Jaja Gabor, it's not too hard to believe that he probably was laughing during his wedding ceremony. I'm going to get to Barbara and their next issue, but I have to tell you a little more about Jaja Gabor before we move on. She was so involved in this whole situation that you would have thought that she was the one getting married to Rubirosa. Her name was in just as many headlines as Barbara's. She wanted Ruby all to herself, even though she was married to someone else. So while it was clear to everyone that she was bitter about Ruby marrying Barbara, Jaja tried to pretend that it didn't matter, that she was actually happy for the new couple. She told the press that she was glad that Rubirosa was getting a hold of Barbara's millions. Now he could finally pay her back the money that he had borrowed from her the previous summer. After the wedding, Jaja was holding news conferences literally every hour, disclosing a little bit of information about herself and Ruby. In one of them, she let the press know that, quote, Ruby called me at 3:30 this afternoon. I don't know if it was before or after the ceremony. What he told me is our business. However, I did get a bunch of flowers from Ruby today with a note reading, I will see you very soon. Yes, I know he shouted lies, lies, lies when told what I said about him hitting me in the eye. But what else could he say? He had to save face. What a sweet fellow. He beats hell out of me, then he marries another woman. If I had been in his place, I would have denied I was even in Las Vegas. End quote. Then, an hour later in her next press conference, she disclosed this, quote, I got rid of a man who was chasing me. I couldn't take it. I had to work too. This whole thing is a vicious cycle. I love George, Barbara loves Ruby, and I don't know who loves Barbara. Ruby doesn't want to work. He thinks it's for peasants. Ruby loved me more than any other man loved me. He told me that after he married Barbara, he would come back to me with enough money so that I'll never have to work again. End quote. You know, not bitter at all. The news writers were living for all of Jaja's petty comments, so they started egging her on. In her next bit of round-the-clock news coverage of the Rubirosa nuptials, one of the writers showed Jaja a photograph of Barbara in her black wedding dress and asked her for a comment. Surely Zsa Zsa would have something nice to say. She told the press this, quote, "It looks like she's on a death march. She should have worn white. I'll bet she hypnotized Ruby," end quote. This whole circus was just insane. Zsa Zsa, as you may know, was part of a sister act. Ava and Magda rounded out the trio of Hungarian buxom beauties who were collectively called the Gabor sisters. Zsa Zsa's sisters didn't like the way that she was carrying on about Ruby. They said that it was hurting their image. And maybe it was hurting them as a unit, but Zsa Zsa's phone was ringing off the hook with offers for TV shows, commercials, radio spots, and even major movie contracts. She could not have cared less if her actions were drying up opportunities for her sisters. Those Gabor sisters were highly competitive. Quick side note about how those gals were. Zsa Zsa's sister Magda ended up marrying Zsa Zsa's husband, George, the one who we're talking about now, George Sanders, in 1970. So, yeah, yuck. And I told you before, Zsa Zsa's quote regarding Ruby showing her love by giving her a black eye. Well, here's the full context of that quote from her conversation with Life magazine just days after the wedding. She posed for a new photo wearing an eye patch. This would be the photo that would get published for her interview. Here's what was written, quote, "In Spanish, Rubirosa means a red rose, but to me it's a black eye," she said, adjusting a big black patch over her right eye. "He said to me, 'If you do not marry me now, I will marry Barbara Hutton.' I said, 'That is a smart idea.' He said, 'Why won't you marry me?' And I said, 'If I must tell you the truth, I am in love with George.' And so then Ruby hits me. I am the luckiest woman who ever lived. He might have broken my head or my nose. A man only beats a woman if he loves her. I always loved George, the love of my life. After our divorce, George and I will be beaux." End quote. This woman was nuts. Barbara was asked if she had a comment about any of Zsa Zsa's claims. She merely said, "I am a lady." I personally think that Barbara knew that she was no match for Zsa Zsa's saucy mouth and just wanted to end the publicity nightmare that her marriage had become. And when it came down to it, in the end, Rubirosa divorced Barbara because she didn't support his relationship with Zsa Zsa. You know, the one that was taking place on Barbara's honeymoon. What a buzzkill. I hate it when my wife won't let me visit my girlfriend. Right, fellas? So that was that. Zsa Zsa got to totally overshadow Barbara on her wedding day. And before she overshadows Barbara in this video, let's get back to Barbara and Doris. Their next cat fight was over the actor, Cary Grant, who was also one of Barbara's ex-husbands, her third ex-husband. Because Rubirosa was Doris's one true love, she thought it would be funny to take the only guy who Barbara thought loved her. Here's the information on the Barbara and Cary Grant relationship. Barbara got married again in 1942, and this time it was to a famous man, Cary Grant. On July 8th, they eloped to Lake Arrowhead, California, and honestly, there is no scandal here. She loved him, and he loved her. But you know how they say that sometimes love just isn't enough? This seemed to be one of those situations, though she did divorce him on the ground of cruelty. But they never had a bad thing to say about each other publicly. She said that his career got in the way of their marriage, and she loved him the most because he was so sweet and gentle. They simply parted ways in 1945. He was reported to be her only husband, who never asked her for alimony. This squabble over Cary Grant was started by Doris, and it was an attempt at revenge for Barbara marrying Rubirosa. But it never really took off. In fact, it was one-sided. Doris flirted with Cary Grant, and because she had millions of dollars, she could flirt with people in ways that most of us could only imagine. She was so bold in her flirtation that she made the huge gesture of buying a home that was close to Cary Grant. It was a mansion that had once belonged to Italian actor Rudolph Valentino. It was called Falcon's Lair. Doris bought this home only a few weeks after Barbara married her Ruby. Here's what was explained about it in a 1954 edition of the Durham Sun. One of the home's best features for Doris was that it offered a clear view of Cary Grant's house. The Sun also reported that the home was small, and Doris was putting in a lot of work to renovate it. She was having walls knocked down to make bigger rooms. It was going to be a completely different place when her workers got done with it. It's almost as if she would have come out better just building a new home somewhere else. But you know what they say about real estate? It's all about location, location, location. And it just so happened that Doris's new house was on the top of a hill. The next place that could be seen from atop the hill was Cary Grant's house. His half-glass house. My. Here's what was written about her new windows. Quote, "Gone are the arched windows. She's had big picture windows installed. The better to see the hills, plus Cary Grant if he's available." End quote. It seems pretty clear why Doris wanted this place, but when Doris made her move on Cary Grant, he simply turned her down. Poor Doris. After all of that, she had to pretend that she loved that house and that location. She probably looked out of her big picture windows into Cary Grant's house and saw him making out with his other girlfriends. I am definitely deducting a point from Doris for this one. The next spat between the Gold Dust twins had to do with property. This happened around 1959-1960, so by this time, both Doris and Barbara had enough time to cool off from the Porfirio Rubirosa drama. Doris had likely had a chuckle to herself about telling Barbara that Ruby was a good guy and to go through with her wedding. There's no doubt in my mind that she enjoyed watching Barbara endure the public humiliation caused by that whole situation. But at this new juncture, she was turning over a new leaf and extending an olive branch to Barbara. By this time in her life, Doris had learned that marriage just was not for her. Barbara kept on trying, and with almost every divorce, due to settlements she had to pay, she was losing more and more of her once massive fortune. Well, after Barbara's divorce number 6, it seems like Doris wanted to give her friendship with Barbara another try and just let bygones be bygones. So she invited Barbara to come and stay at her Hawaiian home, Shangri. This stay was meant as a retreat for Barbara. Much to everyone's surprise, Barbara accepted the invitation. She flew out to Hawaii, got settled in, and got some rest. Doris left and gave her friend the run of the house. After a couple of weeks, Barbara felt refreshed. She felt so good that she decided to do a favor for old Doris. She would surprise her by redecorating her entire home. I mean, what was the deal with all those old Middle Eastern furnishings and art pieces? It was time to get with the times and go modern. But you know, El Cheapo Doris just liked keeping old stuff around. Yeah, sure, the rest of the world called that old stuff priceless antiques. But the rest of the world didn't have to stare at that stuff for the next few weeks. Barbara did. So, Barbara had all of Doris's antiques hauled off and replaced with modern Japanese pieces. The new decor made the interior of Doris's place look eerily similar to Barbara's Japanese-style home in Cuernavaca called Sumiya, which also boasted chic, modern art and furniture. When Doris returned and saw the inside of her home, she became enraged. I'm sure that she wanted to put her size 11 foot right in the crack of Barbara's ass. But she was a lady too. She put Barbara out and told everyone she knew that Barbara has surely gone over the edge. The next issue the heiresses had was over another man. It was another short-lived one, but this time the roles were reversed. Barbara was trying to put the moves on one of Doris's boyfriends. The guy was Joe Castro. Though why Barbara wanted to insert herself into anything with him is beyond me. Let me remind you of who Joe Castro is, so that you can see why it would have been so ridiculous for Barbara to have wanted him. Here's what I previously shared about the extremely toxic relationship that he had with Doris. Doris met Joe Castro in 1952. He was 15 years younger than she. He was in his mid-20s and she was in her early 40s. Now, before I go any further, I know that someone is thinking, "That's the same age difference she had with her first husband. You said that was wrong, but you'll say it's okay for her because she's a girl." You know, the whole, "so it's okay when a woman does it but not a man" thing. I have seen those comments on videos in which I've held women accountable, and for the record, I think that Doris was inappropriate too, only slightly less inappropriate because Joe was an adult when they met. She was just a teenager when James Cromwell started having secret conversations with her. But just so you know, we don't do double standards here on Ty's Hot Mess History. Anyway, within months of meeting, Joe and Doris were living together at Doris's suite at the Bel Air Hotel. It does come across as though she was looking for a plaything in the bed, and he was looking for a sugar mama, and Doris had a lot of sugar. Doris admired his talent on stage, but she didn't like all the attention that he got from the young, pretty women who would come to watch him perform. This would set off her insecurities and send her spiraling into alcohol and drug use in order to deal with how she felt. Why she wouldn't let him go is beyond me. Their relationship stopped being fun as soon as it started. But maybe Doris, who had always been called the ugly one or the less attractive one, had something to prove, like that she could keep this young, handsome man on her arm. She and Joe would get into fights, frequently, break up and make up. Then, Doris's mother died in 1962, leaving her $250 million. Thus, 250 million more reasons for Joe to stick around and pretend that he was interested in Doris. One night in 1963, at her Shangri-La home, Doris was playing her piano, and Joe made a joke that insinuated that her playing wasn't so good. Her response? She grabbed a butcher knife and slashed his arm. This woman was unhinged, and you're about to see that Joe was definitely not an angel. But slicing someone with a knife just because you don't like something that they said? That's more than an overreaction. That could have been fatal. Could Doris have killed someone over a disagreement? I think that she could have, and it looks like she did, and we'll get there. But back to her and Joe Castro. Yeah, sure, she sliced his arm because of his joke. But maybe on New Year's Day, she had turned over a new leaf and was ready to deal with this toxic relationship like an adult. Because on January 1st, 1964, she rang in the new year by throwing him out of her Bel Air mansion, Falcon Lair. And he didn't like that. He loved her house. He went so far as to sue her for wrongful eviction. When he saw that nobody cared about his lawsuit, he turned it up a notch, filing for divorce and requesting alimony payments for Doris in the amount of $5,000 per month. Everyone was shocked to hear about this divorce, but no one was more shocked than Doris. You know why? Because she said she had never married him. This unemployed bozo completely made up this lie and had the nerve to sue Doris on the grounds of cruelty. Even the newspapers were expressing their shock because their first time hearing about this marriage was when Joey announced the divorce. They didn't know how they could have missed a story so big. Then he took his last chance at a money grab and decided to sue for the butcher knife slicing. He wanted $150,000 because Doris tried to kill him and left him with a scar that was so big that he could no longer work. Now, I don't condone her slicing him at all under those circumstances, and she should have had to pay him something for that. But he was laying it on pretty thick by saying that he couldn't work anymore. In the end, none of his claims mattered. Doris's attorneys strong-armed Joe into silence, and he dropped all of his lawsuits against her. But Doris countered his lawsuits with one of her own. and on May 1st of 1964, she obtained an order from a court in Honolulu. It was a restraining order, an order that restrained this fool Joey Castro from saying that he was her husband and that she had ever married him. Now, one would think that after all of that, this relationship would have been over, but no. Doris still wanted Joe, so she made a lot of promises to him, saying that she was going to do all kinds of things to help take his music career to the next level. It seems like she dangled those promises in front of him to keep him around because she knew that he would not have come back otherwise. And her promises worked. He agreed to go back to her. So he's not an innocent victim in any of this. He was, after all, a grown man, and by this time in his 30s. If at any time he didn't like how Doris was treating him, he was able to leave. But Joe had gotten rather comfortable staying at Doris's house. Even if he wasn't attracted to her, he thought that her home was beautiful. And he spent a lot of his years with Doris in that beautiful home, not giving a care about his career. The couple had settled into a dreadful rut. By the very next year, 1965, he was back living in her Bel Air home. Why? Because desperate Doris had set up a recording company just for Joe. And this is so pathetic, but in order to get her man back, she promised to include him in her will. Can you imagine? She also bought him a new Mercedes-Benz. She was literally trying to buy his love. Then, tragedy struck that summer when Doris's ex-husband died. Porfirio Rubirosa was killed when he crashed his Ferrari in Paris. Doris was a wreck. Joe couldn't comfort her because he didn't care about her. So she started spending more time with her friend and confidant, Eduardo Tirella. He was Doris's art buyer, but he was also one of her closest friends, and he cared for Doris, even if none of her husbands or boyfriends did. While Doris was mourning the loss of Rubirosa, Joey was hitting the town with young pretty girls in Hollywood, making Doris look like the fool that she was for him. She got really angry about one young beauty specifically, a singer named Loretta Haddad. A number of people had seen Joe and Loretta out and about, looking like a romantic couple. Then out jumped the vindictive side of Doris that was tired of repeatedly losing to women who were more attractive than she was. She really hated that her money wasn't enough to control the men who she wanted to love her. So, Joey had to pay. And how did she make him pay for making her feel bad? Doris shut down his record company. Then, Doris had to pay, because that made him angry. And how did he make her pay for taking away his precious record company that made him feel like the big man in Hollywood? Joey effed up her house and physically abused her. I mean, he really went wild. He threw stuff all over the place. He broke dishes all over her kitchen floor. And while standing in the frame of one of her French windows, wearing a t-shirt only and nothing on his bottom half, he urinated over the railing and into her garden. Doris had called one of the guys who worked with him at the now shut-down record company to help her, to get Joe and take him away from her house. His name was Peter Brook. When Peter got there, he saw all of the destruction. He witnessed Joe and his half-nude body relieving himself onto Doris's flowers. Then he saw Doris in her bedroom with a broken jaw. Joe had hit her in the face and broke her jaw. Joe Castro and Doris Duke were two disgusting people to each other who should have never been together. He thought that he would be able to pretend to love her and get all of the money that he wanted from her, while dating and sleeping with the women he actually found attractive. And she thought that her money and the opportunities that she could provide him would allow her to control him. They were both wrong. And after all of that happened, it still didn't stop good old gal pal Barbara from wanting a piece of Joe for herself. It's insane. He was nothing but a headache, Why in the world would Barbara want this problem on her hands? I'm sorry, but it had to be about trying to make Doris jealous, because there's no good reason that any woman would have wanted to be with Joe after how he treated Doris. By this time in her life, Barbara was looking her age, or older. They were in their 40s, but Doris was looking, if not young, younger than Barbara. She'd had multiple plastic surgeries, and they were helping her to retain a youthful look. Still, Barbara, who looked like she was old enough to be Joe's granny, called him after she found out that he was with Doris. She told him, "I'd give you more than she would. If you were with me, you'd have a symphony orchestra." Joe said, "I'll pass." As he saw it, he already had an old lady he didn't want. The last thing that he needed was another one who was the same age as Doris and looked even older. But as we know, he moved on to the young, pretty singer who was his age and never looked back at Barbara or Doris. Just before Joe and Doris ended their relationship for good in 1966, they ran into Barbara at a restaurant in Tahiti. There was nothing but air and uncomfortable silence between the two, as Leonard Lyons wrote in a story that I was able to find in the Baltimore Sun from that year. Quote, "America's two wealthiest heiresses, like China and the USA, are aware of each other's existence, but do not recognize each other." End quote. So, I would give the point to Doris, but Joe Castro was no prize. So let's keep going. We know that by this point, the attractiveness scale was weighing in Doris's favor. Doris had become a big fan of plastic surgery, and whatever she was doing to her face seemed to be pleasing to her and to people who were looking at her. Not only her face, but her body was looking great. Doris had always been tall and athletic, and at this point, she was still in good physical shape. Plus, she was also wearing the fashions that were in style, and the big bouffant and full volume hairstyles that were all the rave. Those styling choices helped her to maintain a really youthful vibe. Barbara, by contrast, wasn't using plastic surgery, but that didn't mean that she was aging gracefully. She was just aging. Some might have thought that she was aging poorly. She had been anorexic for years. The bulk of her nutrients came from Coca-Cola, vodka, and the IV vitamin shots she would take. The rest of her quote-unquote diet was cigarettes, codeine, Valium, and morphine. You can imagine how this could make a lady in her 40s look much older than she was. And she continued to dress like she was stuck in her days from being on the best dressed list in the 1940s. Doris looked young and fresh, and Barbara just didn't. Doris looked like a model who had just stepped off of a 1965 fashion runway, and Barbara looked like a woman on the pages of Vogue magazine, from a 1942 edition. So you can imagine why Doris took offense when someone mistook her for Barbara at the airport. Here's what happened. As Barbara's health started to rapidly decline, so did the balance of her bank account. She had always had a habit of overspending, and of course a lot of her husbands made out like bandits in their divorce settlements. But she lived as though she thought that money would just magically replenish itself and find its way into her bank account. So she carried on, creating even more stupid ways to spend money. One of her most ludicrous investments, if you will, was paying for a carrier. This is someone who would carry her everywhere, as if she were a piece of luggage. Yes, Barbara literally stopped walking and bragged about the fact that she could afford to pay others to walk for her. She demanded to be carried everywhere, and someone would always accept the task. I can imagine her now saying, "Look at the poors, walking around on their own legs." Anyway, one morning when Doris arrived at the Los Angeles National Airport, she was met at the gate by an airline employee with a wheelchair, ready to whisk her off to wherever she needed to go. Doris bluntly told the employee, quote, "You've got the wrong one. I'm Doris Duke. The other one is in Mexico." End quote. Well, that's what happens when you're a twin, a gold dust twin. People mistake you for the other one. And gotta say, there's another point for Doris for using her own legs. But Barbara would get to return serve with a quip of her own the next year in the newspapers, and it happened after Doris killed a man. Eduardo Tirella. Now, there's a lot more to this part of the story, and I'm going to cover Mr. Tirella's death in a true crime deep dive story in the near future. But for now, I'll give you just a little bit of the background information that was disclosed at the time, because that's all that really matters for the context of our story today. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to talk about the death of Eduardo Tirella. Eduardo worked for Doris Duke. She hired him in 1956 as her curator of art holdings. As the years went on, the two developed a friendship in addition to their work relationship. He is the man she turned to for comfort after Joe Castro punched her in the jaw. In 1966, he felt like he had accomplished all that he could working for Doris. He was ready to leave Newport, where he had been working at Doris's mansion called Rough Point. His next stop was Hollywood for his new job as a production designer. On October 6th, he packed his suitcases, got a night of rest, and planned to go on some outings with Doris on the next day. He was looking forward to telling his friend that she was about to become his former boss, because now he had made it. Hollywood was calling. Tirella had some friends in common with Doris. They were actually worried about him and told him that she would not be too happy about his leaving her employ. It turned out that his friends were right about that. He told Doris about his new job, and she was not supportive at all. To his surprise, she was angry with him for leaving her. Of course, Doris found a way to make his new job all about herself. I'm sure that her attitude shocked him. After all that he had done for her, protected her and shielded her from men who had been cruel to her, he had been her person to lean on, who would listen to her and literally pick up and move clear across the country with because she had to end a bad relationship. Tirella thought that Doris was a good friend to him. He might not have thought much of her as a boss because she routinely underpaid him. You remember all of that turmoil that he went through when she was with Joey Castro. Nobody has to put up with that kind of stuff on a job. How much was his bonus for dealing with all of that stress and strife? He finally had a great opportunity to make a fair wage and a name for himself doing something that he loved, and all that Doris could think about was herself, and how she didn't want her friend to leave her. The next afternoon, on October the 7th, when Tirella and Doris were getting ready to leave Rough Point, he was stopped by Doris outside of the house. She wanted to talk to him. The discussion quickly escalated into an argument about his leaving her. Some of Doris's staff members could hear the argument because it was so loud, and it lasted for a long time. Everyone seems to agree that those are the facts of the story up to this point. From here, I'll tell you one version of what Doris said happened. Then I'll tell you what Peter Lance discovered, and seems to be the truth because there are witnesses and, frankly, it makes sense. According to Doris, she and Tirella were leaving the house. They were in the car, driving up to the gates that would have to be opened so that they could leave. He was driving. He parked the car but left it running because he was just getting out to open the gate. Doris, who had been sitting in the front passenger seat, then moved into the driver's seat. Her plan was to drive the car forward to the gate to pick him up after he opened the gate. Once she was in the driver's seat, she released the parking brake and put the car in drive. But when she got to the gates, instead of putting her foot on the brake pedal, she accidentally put her foot on the gas pedal, propelling the car forward, right into Tirella first, then the gates. He was pinned between the gates, which were still opening, and the car. Then the car ran over the gates and hit a tree. He ended up under the car. He died from the injuries he sustained. That's what Doris said. At least that's one of the first versions of her account because her story changed every time she told it. Now, that's all that we need to hear this time around. That was pretty much the story that was printed in the news. But what does that have to do with the feud between Doris and Barbara? Well, Barbara was contacted by the media to give a comment on this horrible incident. When asked for her thoughts on why Doris killed Tirella, recalling back to her stay at Doris's Shangri estate, Barbara said, quote, "Perhaps Doris didn't like his taste. She certainly didn't care for mine." End quote. Oh, Barbara. I guess that the point goes to Barb, because killing your friend is just never a nice thing to do. That witticism from Barbara pretty much ended the feud. Doris and her attorneys had bigger fish to fry, dealing with how to pay everyone off so that she wouldn't get convicted of murder and whatnot. A few years later, Barbara's son died. Then so did Barbara in 1979, alone, in her suite at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, and down to her last $3,500 at the age of 66. Perhaps if she had been a little more cheap in her lifetime, she'd have left more money behind. But in the end, it didn't really matter, since she no longer had her son as an heir, and her friends were not real friends, not good enough that anyone would want to leave them a fortune. And Doris, after growing her fortune to over $1 billion and donating a lot of it, seemingly in an effort to drum up some good kismet after running over her friend, went on to befriend some strange companions. One of them was convicted criminal and Filipino First Lady Imelda Marcos, famous for owning 3,000 pairs of shoes. Maybe the two bonded over their love of high-end fashion. By this time, the late 1980s, Doris was losing her mind, and her pet camels were living inside of her home and defecating on her priceless rugs. She'd adopted a grown woman who was a belly dancer. Another member of Doris's motley crew was an eccentric, alcoholic, gay, and semi-illiterate Irish butler she befriended and hired, Bernard Lafferty. Though it was never proven in court, many of her friends and house servants believed that he killed her when she died in 1993, after one last facelift that caused so many other things to go wrong. They thought that he had administered a lethal dose of pain medication to Doris. Her death was not very different from Barbara's. Sure, there were people present in her house, but no real friends. Just people she paid. At the age of 81, Doris died alone too. Interesting. So, if this story happened the way that so many of Doris's acquaintances thought it had, Doris killed one of her servants, then one of her servants killed her. The final point goes to karma, and the feud that only death could have brought to an end. Barbara and Doris were the poor little rich girls who were born the year that the Titanic sank. Well, there was also a poor little rich boy who was born the same year, just months before the Heiresses. He was on the Titanic, in his mom's tummy. He was John Jacob Astor VI, son of John Jacob Astor IV, who died in the Titanic disaster. J.J. Astor VI lived a life that wasn't very different from that of Barbara Woolworth Hutton or Doris Duke. He was dubbed the rich boy nobody wanted, and I published a video about him that you can see here. I will also leave links to it in the description box and in the pinned comment of this video, as well as links to the documentaries on Doris Duke and Barbara Woolworth Hutton that I have already published. My sources for this story are the Buffalo Times Archives, 1930, the Buffalo News Archives, 1930, Morning Free Press Archives, 1930, Press of Atlantic City Archives, 1930, Star Gazette Archives, 1931, The Gazette Archives, 1935, Daily News Archives, 1937, 1944, 1953, and 1954, The Pittsburgh Press Archives, 1940, Life Magazine Archives, 1943, 1944, and 1954, Poughkeepsie Journal Archives, 1944. The Courier Journal Archives, 1947. Honolulu Star Bulletin Archives, 1947. The San Francisco Examiner Archives, 1953. Princeton Daily Clarion Archives, 1954. The Durham Sun Archives, 1954. The Daily Journal Archives, 1954. The Roanoke Times Archives, 1954. Nevada State Journal Archives, 1965. The Baltimore Sun Archives, 1966. Schoolfield Country House Blog. Mount Vernon Argus Archives, 1966. Inside the World's Richest Rivalry by Stephanie Mansfield for Town & Country. And Great Falls Tribune Archives, 1988. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the hot mess history. The link is in the description box.